was our time. We're Uncaged.
Welcome to Topple Uncaged. I'm Steve Topple, and over the next 20 minutes I'll be bringing you the quickest firing news roundup of the week. I'll be getting down and dirty with a very special guest going through some big stories. I'll be taking apart this week's question time, and also I'll be bringing you some of the biggest, most banging political tunes going. So, lock and load, people. Let's go.
Uncaged.
No, 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 no. No, 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 no. Hey, each human being deserves a place to call their own. Yet so many have to journey far from home. Little children in the darkness all alone, seeking freedom. It's about time we break those borders down. There's too much segregation. We're all a part of one nation, yeah. We need to...
What's up, everyone? I am Steve Topple. It is Sunday the 17th of March, and that can only mean one thing. It is this week's edition of Topple Uncaged.
What do you feel when you see those ugly faces? People of all ages locked up in a cages.
Of course, there is only really one news story this week, and it is the horrific murders of 49 people in New Zealand in a terrorist attack by a far-right white supremacist.
Now the people get desensitized to the refugees, them way unidentified, yeah.
The media narratives surrounding this have been mixed, to say the least, but for me, this is a complex yet quite simple issue.
Darkness all alone, seeking freedom. It's about time we break those borders down.
It is all part of a sickness that pervades our society. The symptoms, the war on terror since 2001, and the increasingly feverish anti-Muslim rhetoric that comes out of the media and many politicians. The illness is, of course, capitalism, where society is so driven by profit that it has to other certain groups of people to make excuses for why it's spending money on things which are essentially not good for humanity at all.
After them selfish decision, we're the one who suffer most. Political violence and now all we do ghost. The war and starvation, knife and hang up in a throat. Refugees overpopulation becomes the antidote.
But the disease of this is much more deep-rooted, and I think it stretches back over centuries and centuries and centuries, where society has structured itself in hierarchies centered mostly around white people, where it's led to a mindset where certain people's lives in society are far less valuable than others.
Little children in the darkness all alone, seeking freedom.
And of course, this is all in the pursuit for a small group of people of increased wealth, power and greed.
Segregation. We're all a part of one nation, yeah.
So, on this week's Topple Uncaged, I have cleared the decks effectively because my guest on to discuss what happened in New Zealand and the implications has some staggeringly good insights, and I think everything she says needs to be heard in full. So I will be talking about that, and of course we will still have the music section where I've got a sensational international artist who is one of the most exciting, I think, to emerge as a vocalist and songwriter this year.
I know the city's getting gentrified. Poor people existence denied, but the Rasta man come here so to testify, yeah.
So let's waste no time, let's get on with the show.
Yet so many of the journey far from home. Little children in the darkness all alone, seeking freedom. It's about time we break those borders down. Let's do my...
Dissecting this week's top stories, it's me, free flying with... Obviously, there is no getting away from the biggest story this week, which is the killing of 49 people in 2 mosques in New Zealand. The current suspect, Brenton Tarrant, 28, was brought to court yesterday, Friday the 15th of March, very quickly, it has to be said. He's so far been charged with one single count of murder. Obviously, other charges are still pending. But there's lots of unanswered and some answered already questions surrounding this. Was an attack like this inevitable? Is there anyone who blame should be apportioned to? And also, is there a wider historical context that we are missing in this story? To discuss this and more, I'm very pleased to welcome a friend of mine. She's formerly a journalist for Media Diversified. She also now writes for the Canary and is an overarching freelance writer and commentator. I'm very pleased to welcome Afroze Zaidi-Jivraj. Afroze, thank you so much for coming on. I know this is personally must have been extremely upsetting and distressing for you, so I appreciate you coming on and agreeing to talk about this. Thank you.
Hi, Steve. Yeah, thank you. That's okay. Thank you for having me. I mean, I don't think that there are really any hot takes that I can offer anything particularly that anyone else hasn't already said at this stage, but I appreciate the chance to just be able to talk about this a little bit and about just some of the reasons why possibly that we are where we are and why this happened.
Absolutely, I think that's crucial. And as we said before we went to record, I mean, there's been for want of a better phrase, an effective whitewashing across much of the media of actual Muslim voices in this. As I said to you before we started recording, I watched an edition of Newsnight last night, which managed to get 3 white people and 1 Muslim people talking about it, which is fascinating, but sort of encapsulates the state of the media coverage on this. Let's get straight in. I mean, I want to talk firstly about, obviously, in the wake of this, I don't know if you've seen, but there was a sort of widely documented attack by 2 white men on a Muslim man in London already. I mean, has what happened, the massacre in New Zealand, do you think it's increased the risk globally to Muslims? Will it start off a chain reaction of events, do you think? What's your take on that?
I'd say probably yes and no. So yes, in the sense that, I mean, it's worrying that this person's manifesto and his, the video footage has actually been circulated, including by media outlets, and the fact that, his ideas are out there for people to access. And, so it's possible that people could look at this and get inspired by his ideology or by his actions, and so on. But at the same time, I don't know if it is actually an increased risk, in the sense that I think this only kind of demonstrates the fact that we have been at risk for a while. We continue to be at risk. So I think he was an Australian journalist. His name is Waleed Ali, and he commented on how while it's heartbreaking, everything that's happened, it's not actually shocking at all, in the sense that the environment that's been created and the way that Muslims really have been subjected to this process of dehumanization, it makes it quite easy to justify our mass killing. And that's not just in terms of, from white supremacists, but also just the way that, for example, people in Muslim countries are treated as collateral damage in the name of fighting the war on terror. And so on, loads of different examples. Even when you compare the sort of media coverage of Brenton Tarrant to, other kind of, or to, for example, to Shamima Begum, which is probably the most recent example, there's this, completely stark sort of difference in how this white man is portrayed, how he's humanized compared to the way that Shamima Begum and her baby were completely dehumanized. How, they mentioned how he traveled to Pakistan and to, some other country, as though, that might have played a role in his actions, even though his actions were completely, in his own words, inspired by white supremacist ideology. So, so I think it's, that whole complete process of dehumanization in the media, and by politicians and so on, that's led to this that's led us here, where it's okay for somebody to just justify the killing of Muslims in such a blatant way.
No, I think you're spot on, and I don't, as I said in the introduction, that something like this was always going to happen. It's an inevitable cause and effect. Let's touch on that. Do you think we need to be, firstly, apportioning some blame at the door of the media and politicians of all colours of ideology? Because obviously the war on terror began under a Labour government, effectively, in the UK. How much blame can we apportion at the sort of media narratives and also the influence of politicians over this?
I think a significant portion of the blame does lie with the media as well as with politicians of all stripes. So the media, very recently, actually, we've had examples over the past year of mainstream outlets platforming people like Steve Bannon and Tommy Robinson, and really at the end of the day, this is what's happened in New Zealand is not removed from this mainstreaming of fascist ideas, and this is not just something that's happening in the UK. It's happening in the US. It's happening in Australia, New Zealand, and like in right-wing media outlets, pretty much. Or even mainstream media outlets, across the board. So it's so we can't then sit back. I mean, there have been right-wing commentators like Melanie Phillips and Julia Hartley-Brewer who are like sitting back and saying, "Oh, it's a terrible thing that's happened." Well, actually, when you go around and say, call Muslims, call Islam a disease and call Muslims pests and use all this kind of language of being tired of Islam being shoved down your throat and all of this, like making comments like this, then does lead to a normalization of hatred towards Muslims. So then you can't then turn around and express sympathy for our community when you have actually contributed to the hatred that feeds into it, right? But also, I think that in terms of politicians, it's exactly the same thing. And like, I don't think that this is something that's limited to conservative politicians or it's something that's limited to right-wing or far-right. It's pretty much across the board. We have examples where, you have anti-immigration rhetoric. You have issues of, saying that there's a problem of extremism in the Muslim community, of the whole mechanism of anti-terrorism in the UK and in other parts of the world. All of that is geared towards and fueled by anti-Muslim hatred, pretty much fueled by anti-Muslim racism. So it's it's not surprising at all then that there are people who take away these ideas and feel this sense of entitlement towards the places that they live in, and feel like nobody else has a right to that space and has a right to occupy that space alongside them.
Yes, no, you're spot on. I mean, the comment you said about sick of being Islam shoved down my throat, that was Julia Hartley-Brewer, wasn't it? Tweeted that. I saw that. I mean, you touched on sort of the immigration rhetoric. I mean, for me, broadly, as I said briefly earlier, this of course sort of started really under New Labour and Tony Blair with the Bush administration and the war on terror, as it was called, but it continued as well under the leadership of Ed Miliband, unfortunately. I mean, we all remember the control immigration mugs, which, while not necessarily coming from the same place as the right-wing and far-right rhetoric and that kind of thinking, inadvertently just plays into that whole agenda. I think for me, there's been a failure of the left and progressives over years to really address and tackle this in the way it should be. And like I say, I mean, in some corners, inadvertently playing into it, or not inadvertently, I suppose, depending on what your position is. I mean, do you get that feeling? Has the left and sort of progressive and socialist and democratic socialist voices, have we as a homogenous group done enough over the years, or do we still need to do more to counter this rhetoric?
No, I don't think that enough has been done. I think that, particularly, like I said, with the whole counter-terror apparatus, with the whole, the way that anti-extremism, counter-extremism is dealt with currently, it's something that pretty much all sides of the political spectrum fail to recognize, in the sense that it does feed into a sort of anti-Muslim sentiment and is informed by anti-Muslim sentiment. So, the whole kind of the way that the Prevent strategy operates in terms of the criminalization of religious practice for Muslims. They're actually, when you look at signs of radicalization, they are literally signs of a person becoming more observant Muslim. So, there are links between, the way that Islam is portrayed as a faith, the way that Muslims are perceived as a community, and how terrorism is being defined and how it's being understood and how counterterrorism is being approached consequently. So I think that in terms of the left and the right, in the past and even more recently, really nobody is doing enough to actually acknowledge that. Also, Sadiq Khan, for example, turned around and said that Muslims need to do more to tackle extremism in their own community. So, and he's a Labour politician who's a Muslim. So really, pretty much politicians of all stripes are complicit in this. Also, when it comes to the whole, notion of platforming fascists, I think liberals in particular have been quite vocal about the fact that, I may not agree with somebody's views, but that doesn't mean that they have a right to speak, and, freedom of speech is paramount and so on. But actually, there needs to be more recognition of the fact that it's not just somebody's freedom of speech or right to freedom of speech that is paramount, but actually people's right to live their lives free of fear, right? So by giving, Steve Bannon spoke in Oxford, and then I think days later there were swastikas like spray painted on a community center, so what about the right of those people in that community to live free of fear of fascism, right? Surely that trumps Steve Bannon's freedom of speech. So I think that there's not being done, particularly in terms of no platforming fascists, but also in terms of in terms of recognizing how the whole counter-terror apparatus is working against Muslims and is inherently anti-Muslim in its structure.
For me, part of this the situation that we have come to be in is obviously a result of the system as well. It's obviously it's a result of capitalism. When you go back to the war on terror, it was Naomi Klein who documented very well in the Shock Doctrine that effectively the war on terror was a mechanism not only to get more footholds in the Middle East, but also in the US. It created a whole industry around homeland security worth billions and billions and billions and billions and billions of dollars. So we have that as a sort of intersecting issue there. But I want to touch on more broadly and a historical context with this, because I feel that I haven't seen anyone really discuss this, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts. Because for me, when you look back across the whole course of history, what points to what's happened in New Zealand and what's happened over the past few decades, for me more broadly, is actually what's happened across history, in so much that I think we have a issue here at a societal and a species level, because the demonization of Muslims, along with the demonization of Jewish people, for example, is nothing new across history. You can trace it back to as far back as the Crusades, to what happened with the Ottoman Empire when it was branded the sick man of Europe just before the First World War, and then the consequent effective colonization of that by not least the British Empire at the time, but the French as well, when the Ottoman Empire finally broke up. The demonization of Muslims is an historical thing, and I wonder if those narratives and that almost now subconscious fear, because of the othering that's gone on in society over hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, has now peaked in this century with what we see going on here. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think there's something a lot deeper going on that needs to be addressed?
I don't think that the problem actually is just with anti-Muslim sentiments, but it goes back, if we trace sort of back the roots of it, it really goes back to white supremacy. So there's a difference between the term white supremacist as we understand it today and white supremacy as an ideology. And if we really want to look at the roots of where sort of this whole, conflict began, we really need to trace back white supremacy as an ideology, and that began kind of, you can see it with the colonization of the world from European countries, which led on to things like slavery, things like Orientalism, and the whole the cultural depiction of colonized groups through the colonizer's lens, the whole, geopolitics and hard borders as we know them today, the poverty that came about in former colonies and the corruption that came about as a result, and the occupation of Palestine. All of these basically came about as a result of white supremacy as an ideology. So, the othering of Muslims is only part of the a symptom of that, and that includes racism, it includes anti-blackness, it includes colorism, it includes all of these things. It's not something that is, so it's not just anti-Muslim sentiment in isolation, but it's the entire mechanism of white supremacy that needs to be understood. And I don't think that is currently the case at the moment. Like right now, we see it in terms of the othering of Muslims. It's very much framed as a far-right problem rather than a mainstream problem. But actually, it's none of those things. It's neither limited to Muslims, nor is it a far-right problem. But it is something very much that affects many different oppressed groups. It's something that, that really has had its roots in sort of centuries of history, and that we need to kind of start acknowledging and unpacking before we can actually recognize the role that governments, that societies have played in perpetuating this hatred towards, and this oppression towards marginalized groups.
That was a brilliant appraisal of the situation. Absolutely excellent, and it's something that is not being addressed at all, but is crucial to understanding why we're in the position we're in. I mean, I think as a species, we quite often have a problem viewing things outside the sphere of more than a few decades. But unfortunately, we're now at a point in the history of civilization where I think we need to begin to try and do that, because otherwise we will keep going around in these constant circles like hamsters in wheels. I want to wrap up. You tweeted, I'll read it out. You tweeted, "The word Islamophobia is actually really pissing me off because Muslims are the ones who should be living of fear in white folk, for fuck's sake." I think that's spot on. I mean, the word Islamophobia, whatever good intentions people had from it, has become in many respects somewhat obnoxious now. I don't want to say it can't get much worse than this, because sadly I think it probably can. But do you think there is any light at the tunnel with regards to society beginning to turn a corner with regards to what is happening, not only, as you say, with the demonisation and the anti-Muslim rhetoric, but the othering of people more broadly? Is there any hope on the horizon, or do you think we're going to be stuck in this, quite frankly, dreadful situation for a while yet?
I think firstly, in terms of the tweet, I should probably, put it in the context of the fact that pretty much the majority of what are, so-called terrorist attacks that have taken place in recent years in Western countries have been carried out by white men, right? And I think that's pretty common knowledge by now. But also I think yesterday it came from a place where I was just really frustrated at this idea that, it's anti-Muslim hatred is referred to as Islamophobia quite commonly now, and it's become part of the lexicon, but actually what it really means or where it comes from, I think initially it was used in the Runnymede report, and that report itself did actually imply that some of the fears, quote unquote, that people have, or apprehensions that people have about Muslims may in fact be justified. So it's really, so that is where my frustration comes from, is that that you have still an ongoing kind of rationalization of people's feelings towards Islam and towards Muslims, and a lot of the times it's couched in terms of negative sentiment towards Islam, which is something that people like Julia Hartley-Brewer and Melanie Phillips and so on and Sam Harris and other right-wing commentators are very good at, is saying, well, we are criticizing Islam, we aren't criticizing Muslims. And actually I did my master's thesis on this very subject, is that when people criticize Islam, it is really an indirect way of expressing negative sentiment or their apprehensions towards Muslims as a group, and so that's partly where my frustration and where that tweet came from, but also I think that in terms of hope, for me personally, I see things from a micro level, from my day-to-day interactions with other people, with my local community, which I'm very actively involved in, and a macro level, right? So I think that I try as much as possible to get involved in interfaith activities in my local mosque. I try to speak to people of other faiths, of no faith, going out into the world and speaking to different communities, to different, people from all kinds of different backgrounds. And in that sense, I only have faith on a micro level because I see every day people who actually don't feel don't feel an animosity towards Muslims, who don't have actually, this kind of, who I don't feel like, I should be afraid of in terms of, their ideologies, or in terms of the fact that, who I don't feel a threat from because of my being Muslim. So that is very much a day-to-day experience for me. I am hopeful in the sense that there are good people out there, absolutely. But from a macro level, I'm not particularly hopeful, and I don't particularly believe in kind of this idea of saying that there is hope just for the sake of it, because I feel like ultimately the world is what it is. It is still run by capitalists, by white supremacists, by people who will put power and wealth, and their own interests above the good of the world. And so I think in that sense, I don't think things are likely to get much better on a macro level, on a global scale. But the hope that I sort of get is from the micro, from the the interpersonal, my day-to-day reactions with people and getting to know people and forming relationships within my own community, and online as well, on social media and so on, and that is really what gives me hope that actually all is not lost.
Yeah, I'm completely with you on that. I have, as you say, less hope for change on a macro level. I think we need to shift our mindsets as a society, as it were, to stop thinking that we can rely on big government and big organisations to affect change. And I think, as you quite rightly point out, we have to shift to looking at micro-level, community-based change as the way forward. Whether the rest of the world is going to catch up with us, Afroze, I'm not sure. But
No.
I think I'm with you on that. We need to shift towards a more communitarian model, but that is for another podcast. Afroze, that was some of the most insightful comments I've heard on the situation in New Zealand. As I say, I know this must be extremely distressing for you, so I appreciate your candid comments and also the insight you've given. It's a pleasure to have you on, because it's always nice to talk to you anyway, but it's a pleasure to have you on. Afroze, thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks so much, Steve. All right.
And here's this week's banger in Revolutionary Birdsong. My guest on this week's podcast is probably one of the most interesting acts to emerge this year. Now, do you want to know why I say interesting? Because he is not a new act. He is part, or was part, of a legendary reggae group, hugely successful, but he has now made the departure going solo. And with that has come a bit of a change in musical style. He is fascinating. He has got the silkiest, smoothest voice. He is the legendary Kumar. Kumar, thank you so much for coming on the podcast this week. It's a real treat to have you on, I have to say.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks for having me,
No, it is my pleasure. Now, look, I think you are one of the most interesting artists to certainly come out of Jamaica this year, if not emerging generally, because you were the lead member of Raging Fire, hugely successful reggae group, countless hit tracks, countless collaborations, Grammy nomination as well to boot, and now you've gone solo. And with that, as I said, there's come a bit of a musical change. But, I mean, first up, how have you found going sort of out on your own? Because it must be quite well, I imagine it's quite different to being part of a group. You haven't got that kind of sort of protection, if you like. You're out there on your own now, really. How's that been?
Well, I mean, it's been very adventurous, it's been very, crazy. I've been trying a lot of new things, in terms of my recording style and my musical styles. But, apart from that, it's the same thing, because I still have a band. I have musicians who are now in the process of rehearsing my new songs and the old songs, because majority of the Raging Fire projects and songs in the olden days, I wrote the lyrics, for most of the songs, about 80%, I would say. So it's like, it's the same process, I'm still writing, I'm still, recording, and, it's been a bit different, because you don't know, so we did develop a certain level of brotherhood, as a band over the years. But now it's a little different learning, people. But I still have great friends and old friends from Raging Fire, like past members like Deborah, who was also the engineer for years ago, and Gizmo, so I still have Raging Fire.
That's good. I mean, like I said, what's also really interesting is your most recent track, It's All Right. It's absolute beautifully written and beautifully produced song, produced by Riff Raff, wasn't it, as well, actually? Yes. Yeah. It's all right. I mean, there was still, listening to it, there was still sort of, you could hear sort of tinges of reggae influence in there. There was sort of the bubble pattern. There was sort of a bit of a bubble pattern going on. There was some kettle drums, but it was a real departure from your previous work. Do you know who it reminded me of, actually, when I listened to it for about the second time? It reminded me of Tracy Chapman a bit. That kind of... Yeah, no,
I've heard that.
Okay, yeah, it had that kind of vibe and had that kind of feel about it. And like I say, it's quite a departure. I mean, why did you choose to change musical style somewhat and sort of spread your wings?
Well, I wouldn't say I changed musical styles. I'm just expressing how I feel all the time. So, I mean, if I feel rooted today, I make reggae music because I record every day. So, a lot of people, since I've released It's All Right, I wouldn't say a lot because it's just like a handful, but you still have fans and people will link and say, yo, I prefer you when you were doing whatever you were doing. And I'm saying, but I haven't stopped. I just released one song, which is separate. So why are people saying this? Because, if you listen to what's coming, I have lots of more reggae songs, roots songs. But what I'm trying to get people to understand is that my name is Kumar and I'm a musician and I play the piano. I play the guitars, I play a little bass, a little drums. I like writing music. I love classical music. I love rock and roll. I love jazz. I love music. I love the history of music. I love history. So I would be cheating myself if I just did what people wanted me to do all the time. I would not be happy because I've grown since I've started touring in the reggae circuit and playing all the reggae festivals everywhere. And, I've grown to the level where I realize that to help that market, in any way, I need to actually expand my wings to be able to say, yeah, this is where I started in reggae music. So I'm here now and I'm still playing my reggae music. I could bring it with me wherever I'm going, but the key is not to stay in one place, in terms of too long, because then if there's no growth in terms of your outlook on life, it doesn't necessarily have to be financial or material growth. It's just your outlook. It has to improve, in order for you to really, well, that's my opinion. It doesn't have to be for everybody else.
That's really interesting. I picked up on something there, actually. You say, because you trained as a classical pianist, didn't you? I trained as a classical pianist and classical singer as well. But it's not really what I ever wanted to do. I was more into sort of soul and R&B. How did do you find as a classically trained musician, has it helped you with writing the kind of music you want to write? Has it given you a good grounding, do you think?
Yes, because the melodies, for example, music back in, I would say, in the Renaissance or maybe the Baroque period, right? Like, people didn't have microphones. Music was written for small halls. Music was written for people to be able to hear what the pianist or the harpsichord or whatever they had playing at that time, to be able to play in a small room. So if you realize over the years, with this knowledge that I've gained, I realized that when you write songs, you could write songs based on even the venue that you're thinking that you want to play in the future. So yeah, no, it's true. Like for me, so you could write songs that fit stadiums, you could write songs that fit auditoriums, you could write songs, and it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to write song for that specific purpose, but it's still a factor to consider when you're doing a record, when you're doing an album. So for me, over time, I think learning all of these different things about each era of music is not necessarily trying to play like Bach or Beethoven or Tchaikovsky, but it's to actually understand, the temperament they used when they were writing these notes that they couldn't hear before they put it on the piano. It's just something that they couldn't see, but they actually realized that this part of the frequency, if you play it here, or if you write words that actually feel like this frequency, you know what I mean, then it makes sense for me. So basically, this is what music teaches me over the time, because I've played in a lot of venues and I've realized not all my songs feel great in some of the venues, and I wonder why. But then when I check some other venues when I'm playing, I'm like, whoa, this song was killer tonight. Why? So there's factors, and it's all, the only reason why I think like this is because I studied music. So it doesn't necessarily mean that, I'm trapped in the classical space or rock space to say this is what influences me daily, but it's just everything coming together, so you're thoughtful whenever you're producing or you're writing,
No, that's really interesting, and that kind of that mindset you have of thinking about, if you like, where you'll be performing, or sort of bearing that in mind. That shows with It's Alright, because on YouTube there's some brilliant versions of it. You've got a great acoustic version you did for Reggaeville, didn't you?
Yes.
Then there's a live version in Amsterdam, and the song it fits so well in kind of small kind of venues. It makes it very personal, which I think the overriding sort of message behind It's Alright for me, it was all about sort of personal but also spiritual freedom.
Yeah, because not to cut you, but a popular venue now that people don't even look at is your car. Like, most people listen to music inside their motor vehicles, and if you're thinking about producing a record, like, you have to consider the fact that people are going to put this inside their car and drive 80 miles down the highway, and the bass in this record needs to be present, especially in a car, and the vocal has to be in a space where it's clear, because when you're driving and you know what I mean, and you're searching for it, that's why hip-hop music, is so successful, and trap music and all these music, because it's designed for close range, you know what I mean? It's not like disco music. If somebody's listening disco at home, you'd be like, what the hell? So it's like, but people do it, not to say it's whatever, but people do it, but it's just what the music was made for, so I think over time, it really has influenced the music from Jamaica, because we grew up on the sound system, playing in the yard, outdoor, you know what I mean? It's like African music, you could hear it from miles away, when people chanting in their villages. So it's like, I think, all of this knowledge, man, just makes you want to expand how you create music and do it how you want to do it. Why follow one set pattern? If I wake up today and I'm like, oh my God, I'm on stage and it's the same thing over and over again, and there's no chance to improve it or add anything different because this is what people expect, it doesn't work for me personally. I have to be free. I have to be able to play acoustically, anyway, classically if I wish. If I want to do an opera, maybe I could. Who knows? I just want to be free in terms of music. And the system forces you to choose a genre, and that's when it becomes a business. You know what I mean? Because then you have to think about all this commercial stuff. But then if you're making music and it sounds commercial, then that's not a problem, because the commercial is not, they don't own, you know what I mean, what people listen to. People like it. So I think when people judge you or judge me, sometimes you're like, oh, you're going commercial. I'm like, oh my God. No, I'm just making music. It happens to go commercial. You know what I mean? Then what am I going to do? I'm creating music that people want to hear. People want to hear great melodies, great lyrics on dancey beats. People want to move.
You're going to be dropping an album this year, aren't you? We think.
An album or a project. Maybe just a project is like 8, 9 songs, maybe not calling it an album as yet, but definitely dropping a body of work. And, you know, I mean, I'm booked for a few events, a few shows, you know, around the world, you know, coming up. So it's like, it's perfect timing for me to really release more music, because people are like, oh, you only release one song. And I'm like, yeah, let's see if you really want some more music, you know. But you know, like, it's been overwhelming, people reaching out. So I have a new song now coming up with Jesse Royal.
I was about to ask you about that, yeah, because that sounds massive. Jesse Royal, Romain Virgo.
Yeah, and I have one with Romain Virgo coming up as well. That's another one.
Oh, there's two?
It's a different song. So I have one song with Romain Virgo, one song with Jesse Royal, and I have one by myself coming out. So the one with Romain Virgo and the one by myself is produced by Frankie Music, who did Coffee's Ragamuffin and also Ja Glory when I was in Reaching Fire. So
Kumar, you are one of the nicest people I have spoken to on this podcast. And you are, seriously, I don't say that lightly. But also absolutely fascinating, and I love your vision and your sort of focus, if you like. It's absolutely brilliant, and I think you're going to blow up this year. I really hope so as well, because I mean, the music is fantastic. Acoustically, live, you're superb. Your voice is delicious. You're just brilliant. Kumar, thank you so much for coming on Topple Uncaged. It was a real pleasure to have you on.
Yes, man, give thanks. And I mean, you could tell the listeners also that you could find me everywhere. I'm on Instagram, I'm on Facebook, and Spotify. If you're searching for Kumar on Spotify, you're going to have to make sure you look at the picture, because guess what? There's so many Kumars from India, and I'm the only Kumar from Jamaica, so you can't miss.
He is such an individual. Kumar, thank you so much.
All right, give thanks, Steve. Have a great one, man.
What a lovely guy Kumar is. How good is he? So I'm very excited to present his new track. It was only released on the 14th of March, but here it is. This is Kumar with Dem No Real. Kumar, Dem No Real.
Dem no real, and we no sure of them. Can't knock on we door of them. Dem no real, and we no sure of them. Cause they see we getting richer when we poor of them. Dem no real, we no sure of them. Can't knock on we door of them. Them no real, and we no sure of them. Cause they see we getting richer when we poor of them. Tell all of who I carry feelings, all of who bad mind, and who I carry your name go at the back of the line. And who I can go bright and I want your shine. Me say me pray to Father God, I beg you help them one time. And I work every day, working so hard for my family, sacrificing all of me. Still they wanna see me grieve. Them no real, and we no sure of them. Can't knock on we door of them. Them no real, and we no sure of them. Cause they see we getting richer when we poor of them. Them no real, we no sure of them. Can't knock on we door of them. Them no real, and we no sure of them. Cause they see we getting richer when we poor of them. Be careful where you put your trust. Heart of mankind can be tough. Choose your friends, them wise enough. It's a choice, you can't use your eyes. No matter what, still you gonna watch my money. Still you gonna watch my money. Same way. Them no real, and we no sure of them. Can't knock on we door of them. Them no real, and we no sure of them. Cause they see we getting richer when we poor of them. Them no real, we no sure of them.
And that's it. Episode 18 of Topple Uncaged is done. I would like to thank my fantastic guests this week, the incredible Afroze Zaidi-Jivraj. Follow her on Twitter, it's at AfrozeFC. The incredible Kumar. Follow him on Twitter, it's at KumarFire with a Y bent. As always, behind the scenes, thanks to the love of my life, the gorgeous Nicola Jeffrey. Follow her on Twitter, it's at Nicola C. Jeffrey. My man in the booth, sounds engineer Gav Pause. Follow him on Twitter, it's at Pause with the Z Radio. And my in-house singer, it's Ray Star Music. Follow her on Twitter, it's at Ray_Star113. Finally, thanks to the Canary for uncaging me. Please take care of yourselves this week. I will see you next Sunday.
Uncaged.